"You'll never amount to anything," my uncle sneered as he stole my inheritance. I stayed silent and watched him squander it all, until the day he realized I owned his company. My grandmother's funeral was on a Tuesday. I remember because it was raining, and Uncle Nolan complained about how the weather would ruin his new Italian leather shoes. That's the kind of person he is, standing over his mother's casket, worried about his shoes. I was holding the eulogy notes in my pocket, the paper growing damp from my sweating palms. Grandma Penelope had asked me to speak, not him. She'd always seen something in me that others missed, especially Nolan. "You're like your grandfather," she'd tell me. Quiet on the surface, but always thinking 3 steps ahead. The rain was picking up as they lowered her casket. I noticed Nolan checking his phone, probably stock prices or whatever else he deemed more important than this moment. I wanted to say something, but Grandma's words echoed in my head. "Elias, dear, sometimes the smartest move is to let others think they're winning." 3 days later, we gathered at Avery's office for the reading of the will. I'd spent countless afternoons in Grandma's study, discussing her business empire, learning about every company, every investment. She'd built it all from scratch after Grandpa died, turning a small family business into something remarkable. "Your inheritance isn't just money," she'd say. "It's a legacy of patience and wisdom." Nolan arrived 20 minutes late, reeking of expensive cologne. He barely acknowledged me, just nodded at Avery and dropped into the leather chair like he owned the place. I caught a glimpse of his shoes. They were fine, of course. The first red flag came when Avery started reading. Something felt off about her tone, the way her eyes kept darting between the documents and me. Then came the bombshell. Nolan was named executor of the estate. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral, just like Grandma taught me. "There must be some mistake," I said quietly. Grandma and I discussed this extensively. Nolan's smirk made my blood boil. "Discussions don't mean anything without paper, kid." Mom clearly knew who could handle the responsibility. I watched as Avery outlined the terms. Nolan would manage the estate and companies for 5 years before any distributions could be made. He'd have complete control over all operations and investments. My throat tightened as I realized what this meant. "The documents appear to be in order," Avery said, but something in her eyes told me she wasn't convinced. "All properly notarized and filed." Nolan was practically glowing. "Face it, Elias. You're not cut out for this. What do you know about running companies? You'll never amount to anything if you don't learn how the real world works." I said nothing, remembering the last conversation I had with Grandma. She'd been unusually serious that day, her hands shaking slightly as she handed me a small flash drive. "Keep this safe," she'd said, "and remember what I taught you about playing the long game." That evening, as I sat in my apartment staring at my laptop screen, pieces started falling into place. The flash drive contained years of correspondence, financial records, transaction histories, but more importantly, it had Grandma's real estate strategy guide, her blueprint for building her empire. I noticed a pattern in her acquisitions, something subtle that most people would miss. She'd built redundancies into her company structure, creating a web of interconnected entities. "Always have a backup plan," she told me, "and never let anyone see all your cards at once." That night I made a decision. Nolan wanted to play games? Fine. But I'd play by Grandma's rules. The next morning I called Arya, my old friend from college. "Remember that startup idea we discussed? I think it's time." "The tech platform? But you said we needed capital." "Things have changed," I replied, thinking of the small inheritance from my other grandmother that I'd been saving. It wasn't much compared to what Nolan was controlling, but it was enough to start over. The next few weeks, I watched Nolan parade around town, boasting about his new position. He started making changes immediately, firing key personnel, restructuring departments, taking out loans against stable assets. Classic Nolan, all flash and no substance. But I stayed quiet, remembering Grandma's words about patience. I had the flash drive, her lessons, and most importantly, I had time. Nolan thought he was playing chess. But Grandma had taught me Go, a game where the true strategy only becomes apparent in the endgame. I set up a small office downtown, Nothing fancy. Started building my team quietly, picking up the talented people Nolan had carelessly discarded. Every time he made a public announcement about his bold new direction, I added another piece to my puzzle. The day I registered my company, I used a name that would have made Grandma smile, a subtle reference to her first business. Nolan was too busy redecorating his new office to notice that someone was systematically acquiring small but strategic shares in various support companies. A month later, I got an interesting call from Eli, one of Nolan's business partners. "Your uncle," he said hesitantly, "he's making some concerning decisions." I just listened, thinking about Grandma's favorite saying. In business, like in life, people tell you everything you need to know. You just have to be patient enough to listen. The wheels were in motion now. Nolan thought he'd won, but I could almost hear Grandma chuckling. The real game was just beginning, and I had no intention of playing by his rules. Sitting in my modest office that evening, looking at the city lights, I smiled, thinking about Grandma's last gift. Not the inheritance Nolan thought he'd stolen, but the lessons she'd spent years teaching me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't a dramatic confrontation, but a carefully laid plan that unfolds so naturally your opponent doesn't realize they're losing until it's too late. I opened my laptop and started typing an email to Arya about our next move. Nolan wanted to teach me about the real world? Fine. Class was in session. Update 1. It's been 6 months since my last update. A lot has happened, but Grandma always said timing was everything. Today I watched Uncle Nolan throw a $200,000 party to celebrate his successful restructuring of her company. The irony? He was celebrating in a building I now secretly owned. Let me back up a bit. Remember Arya, my friend from college? We've built something interesting. Our tech platform started small, focusing on streamlining supply chain management for medium-sized businesses. Nothing flashy, just efficient. The kind of business Grandma would have appreciated. 3 months ago I was reviewing some old files from Grandma's flash drive when I noticed something odd. She'd maintained relationships with dozens of small suppliers, companies that seemed insignificant on their own but formed a crucial network. Nolan, in his infinite wisdom, had been cutting ties with these unnecessary partnerships to reduce costs. I called Eli, Nolan's business partner, for coffee. He looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from watching a train wreck in slow motion. "Your uncle," Eli said, stirring his coffee absently, "he just fired the entire research department. Says innovation is overrated." I kept my face neutral, but inside I was smiling. Grandma's words echoed in my head. The best opportunities come disguised as someone else's mistakes. Through Arya's company, we started hiring these experienced researchers. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious. 1 here, 2 there, each bringing their knowledge, their projects, their client relationships. But here's where it gets interesting. Remember those small suppliers Nolan deemed worthless? Turns out many of them held patents that Grandma's main company relied on. Patents that would need renewal and renegotiation, right around the time Nolan would be required to transfer control of the estate. I had Avery discreetly look into the original will's filing. Something wasn't adding up, but we needed more time to piece it together. Meanwhile, I focused on growing our operation. One morning Eli called me, sounding anxious. Nolan's taking out another loan. He's using the Richardson property as collateral. The Richardson property, Grandma's first real estate investment. The foundation of everything she built. I felt a flash of anger, but remembered her lessons about keeping emotions out of business decisions. That afternoon I met with Arya to discuss expanding our platform. She'd been working on an AI component that could predict supply chain disruptions. The big companies are struggling with outdated systems, she explained. We could offer something better. We started approaching Nolan's smaller clients first, the ones he'd been neglecting while chasing bigger fish. It was almost too easy. They were hungry for attention, for someone who understood their needs. Then came the incident that confirmed we were on the right track. I was having lunch at Grandma's favorite cafe when I overheard 2 of Nolan's executives at the next table. "He's losing it," one whispered. Yesterday he screamed at the board for questioning his decision to sell off the tech division. The tech division, Grandma's pride and joy. The part of the business she'd built specifically for the future. I pulled out my phone and texted Arya. Time for phase 2. We started buying up shares in the companies surrounding Nolan's operation, not the main company that would have tipped our hand. Instead, we focused on the support structure, suppliers, distributors, service providers, creating what Grandma used to call a silent majority. Eli proved invaluable, though he didn't realize it. Every complaint about Nolan's mismanagement was another piece of the puzzle. Every rushed decision, every burned bridge, every squandered opportunity became our advantage. Last week Nolan announced a bold rebranding initiative that would cost millions. The same week, 3 major clients quietly signed with us. They didn't know about my connection to Nolan. To them, we were just a promising new company offering better solutions. Yesterday, I received an interesting email from one of Grandma's old friends. Apparently, she'd left a sealed letter with instructions to deliver it to me when the time was right. The timing of its arrival felt significant. But the real revelation came during Nolan's celebration party tonight. I watched from across the room as he bragged about his success to anyone who would listen. He was standing under a massive chandelier, gesturing wildly with a glass of expensive champagne. When Eli approached me, "I found something," he said quietly, glancing around. "About the will. There were 2 versions filed on the same day." I kept my expression neutral, but my heart was racing. 2 versions? Eli nodded, looking uncomfortable. "The timestamps, something's not right. And there's more. The notary who signed the current version, they don't exist." I thought about the sealed letter waiting in my office. About Grandma's lessons on patience and strategy. About her favorite saying, "In business, the truth is like a spider's web, invisible until the light hits it just right." The party continued around us, Nolan's laughter echoing off the walls of the building he thought he controlled. If he'd bothered to check the property records carefully, he might have noticed some interesting changes in ownership over the past few months. I excused myself and headed to my office. It was time to read that letter. Something told me Grandma had anticipated this moment, had planned for it, just as she'd planned everything else. The game was entering its next phase. And for the first time, I felt certain we were ahead. Nolan might have the spotlight, but I had something better. I had Grandma's playbook, and he didn't even know the game had started. Sitting at my desk, holding the unopened letter, I smiled, thinking about Nolan's words at the funeral. "You'll never amount to anything." The next few weeks would be interesting. Very interesting indeed. Update 2. Grandma's letter changed everything. I've spent the last month piecing together what really happened. The truth is bigger than a forged will. It's about a promise my grandmother made to herself and to me. But let me start with last Tuesday. I was in my office reviewing acquisition reports when Eli burst in without knocking. His face was pale, hands shaking as he dropped a stack of documents on my desk. "Nolan's been cooking the books," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I found discrepancies going back months. He's been inflating revenues, hiding losses, taking out secret loans." I pulled out Grandma's letter from my desk drawer. "I know," I said quietly. She knew he would. The letter had explained everything. Grandma hadn't just been teaching me business. She'd been preparing me for this exact scenario. She'd known Nolan would try to seize control. Known he'd forge documents. Known he'd eventually destroy himself. "Your uncle," she'd written, "has always been predictable in his greed. By the time you read this, he will have likely done exactly what I expected. Check the safety deposit box at First National, box 237. The key is where we used to hide your birthday presents." Inside that box I found the original will, properly notarized and witnessed, along with detailed records of every transaction, every decision, every step that led to building her empire. But more importantly, I found her real masterstroke, a series of convertible notes that, when exercised, would give the holder controlling interest in key subsidiaries. Notes that were now in my possession. Arya has been instrumental in what happened next. Our tech platform had grown beyond our initial projections, absorbing talent and clients from Nolan's crumbling empire. But she'd also been quietly documenting everything, every questionable decision, every violated regulation, every breached contract. Your grandmother was brilliant, she told me over coffee last week. She built redundancies into everything. Every critical system, every important relationship had a backup plan. Nolan's been dismantling these safeguards one by one, thinking he's cutting costs. The house of cards started falling faster than even I expected. 3 days ago, one of Nolan's rushed restructuring decisions triggered a cascade of contract violations. By trying to consolidate power, he'd actually activated several of Grandma's carefully placed failsafes. I watched from my office as he called an emergency board meeting. Through the glass walls of the conference room across the street, I could see him gesturing frantically, his face getting redder by the minute. The board members sat stone-faced, copies of Arya's documentation spread before them. That's when Avery made her move. She'd been gathering evidence of the will's forgery, working with the authorities behind the scenes. The timing couldn't have been better. Just as Nolan was trying to explain away the financial irregularities, she walked into the board meeting with 2 officials. I didn't need to be in the room to know what happened next. I'd seen the evidence myself, not just of the forged will, but of years of financial manipulation. Nolan hadn't just been stealing my inheritance. He'd been systematically looting the company. Eli called me an hour later. He's gone completely off the rails, he said. Started accusing everyone of conspiring against him. Then he tried to delete everything from his computer. I smiled, thinking about the backup servers Arya had set up months ago. Did he really think Grandma wouldn't have disaster recovery protocols in place? The next 48 hours were intense. As news of the irregularities spread, clients started jumping ship right into the arms of our company. Suppliers began enforcing contract terms that Nolan had ignored. The carefully built web of relationships and fail-safes that Grandma had constructed began to activate, one by one. Yesterday morning I finally decided to visit the main office. The security guard, the same one who's been there since Grandma's time, gave me a knowing smile as I walked in. The lobby was chaos, executives rushing around, phones ringing off the hook. I took the elevator to the top floor, to Grandma's old office. Nolan had redecorated, of course, all chrome and black leather, trying to erase every trace of her. But he'd missed something crucial. Behind the pretentious modern art piece he'd hung on the wall, there was still a small mark. A tiny arrow Grandma had carved, pointing to what looked like a normal section of wood paneling. I pressed it, just like she'd shown me years ago. A hidden compartment popped open, revealing one final envelope. Inside was a single page, dated just weeks before she died. It was a transfer document, signing over her personal shares in the holding company, not to the estate, but directly to me. Completely legal. Completely separate from the will. Nolan had been so focused on controlling the estate that he'd missed the bigger picture. The door opened behind me. I turned to see Nolan standing there, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face ashen. "How?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How did you do this?" I held up Grandma's letter. "I didn't," I said quietly. "She did. You were so busy looking down on me, you never noticed her teaching me how to look ahead." He stepped forward, reaching for the letter. I pulled it back, watching the realization dawn in his eyes. All those times he'd mocked me for spending time with Grandma, listening to her stories, learning her strategies. She'd been preparing me for this moment. The phone on his desk, my desk now, started ringing. The caller ID showed the board chairman's number. Nolan stared at it, then at me, finally understanding. He wasn't just losing control of the estate. He was about to lose everything. I picked up the phone, keeping my eyes on my uncle. "I'll be right down," I said. "And please have security escort Mr. Nolan out. We have some things to discuss about the company's future." As I watched security lead him away, I thought about Grandma's words. The best revenge isn't taking something from someone, it's letting them lose it all by themselves. The board is waiting. Time to restore what Nolan nearly destroyed, and to build something new, something worthy of Grandma's legacy. But first, I think I'll rehang her portrait in the lobby. Right where it belongs. Final update. Sometimes revenge is best served in front of a boardroom full of witnesses. It's been 2 weeks since my last update. A lot has happened, and I want to share how everything played out, especially yesterday's board meeting. Nolan showed up in his usual expensive suit, though it hung looser on his frame. The past weeks hadn't been kind to him. He'd been avoiding my calls, trying to rally support among the old guard. What he didn't know was that I'd spent those 2 weeks reviewing every decision he'd made in the past year. Single. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. At 8:30, I had Arya start implementing our final protocol, something we'd coded specifically for this moment. One by one, access to critical systems began switching over. Security cards, email accounts, server permissions, everything. At 8:45, Eli texted me. He's here. Looking nervous. I waited until 8:55 to enter the boardroom. Nolan was at his usual seat, shuffling papers, trying to look confident. The other board members were quietly looking through the folders we'd placed at each seat, detailed reports of every questionable transaction, every manipulated number, every diverted fund. "Good morning," I said, taking my grandmother's old seat at the head of the table. Nolan's face twitched. That seat had been his for the past year. "You're in my chair," he said, trying to sound authoritative. I smiled, thinking of all those times he talked down to me. "No, Uncle Nolan. I'm in Grandma's chair. And we need to talk about what you've been doing with her company." That's when Avery walked in, followed by 2 officials. Nolan's face went pale. "Mr. Nolan," one of them said, "we have some questions about certain financial discrepancies." What happened next was almost theatrical. As Avery began presenting evidence of the forged will, I had Arya display our findings on the boardroom screen. Every unauthorized loan, every inflated number, every secret account, laid bare in high-definition detail. "This is ridiculous," Nolan sputtered. "I was authorized." "By whom?" I interrupted, pulling out Grandma's original will. "This document, the real one, gives you no such authority." In fact, I pressed a button on my phone. The boardroom doors opened, and in walked the real notary who'd witnessed Grandma's original will. Nolan jumped up. "This is a setup. You can't." "Sit down, Uncle Nolan," I said. "We're just getting started." For the next hour, we methodically dismantled every defense he tried to mount. When he claimed ignorance of the financial manipulation, we showed emails in his own words. When he tried to blame subordinates, we played recorded meetings where he'd given the direct orders. But the real satisfaction came when we reached the topic of the Richardson property, Grandma's first building. The one he'd used as collateral for his personal loans. "You really should have read the fine print," I said, sliding a document across the table. "Grandma put that property in a separate trust, one that matured on my 30th birthday. Which was last week." The blood drained from his face as he realized what that meant. The loans he'd taken out were fraudulent. The collateral wasn't his to offer. "You can't prove." I nodded to Arya, who pulled up one final document. It was security footage from 6 months ago, Nolan in his office, practicing Grandma's signature, surrounded by draft versions of the forged will. "Your office camera," I explained. "The one you thought you disabled. Grandma had a backup system installed years ago. She never trusted you. Wonder why?" The officials stepped forward. Nolan looked around wildly, but found no allies. The board members were staring at their folders, expressions hard. "Wait," he pleaded. "We can work something out. I'm still your uncle." "You stopped being family the moment you tried to steal Grandma's legacy," I said quietly. "But don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to think about your choices." As they let him out, I pulled one final envelope from my briefcase. "Oh, and Uncle Nolan? Remember all those times you said I'd never amount to anything?" I opened the envelope and laid out the papers inside. Ownership documents for his personal holdings. His house, his cars, his precious art collection. All purchased with stolen money. All now subject to seizure. "Turns out," I said as he was led away, "I amounted to enough to take back everything you stole, and then some." The aftermath was surprisingly peaceful. We spent the rest of the day reinstating key personnel, restoring Grandma's original policies, and beginning the process of rebuilding what Nolan had nearly destroyed. Late that evening I sat in Grandma's old office, my office now, looking at her portrait. Arya knocked and entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You okay?" she asked, handing me one. I nodded, thinking about everything that had happened. You know what's funny? He was so focused on stealing her money, he never realized she'd left something much more valuable. Her knowledge. Her strategies. Her wisdom. Arya smiled. "So, what's next?" I turned to my laptop, where dozens of emails from relieved employees and clients were pouring in. We rebuild. We grow. We do what Grandma would have wanted. And Nolan? I looked at the news alert that had just popped up on my screen, something about charges being filed, terms like fraud and embezzlement jumping out. "Nolan taught me one valuable lesson," I said. "Sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning, it's making sure they know exactly how badly they lost." Tomorrow we'll start implementing the changes Grandma had planned before she died. But tonight, I'm just sitting here looking at her portrait, raising a coffee cup to the woman who taught me that patience, intelligence, and careful planning beat brute force every time.